asking. I think the recording just started, which is great. Um, so the word Maribyrnong is an anglicized version of a Wurundjeri term, which roughly means I can hear a ringtail possum. And this is part of the lesson that Aboriginal people have been asking the white world to learn for a long time, just to pause and to sit and to really just listen deeply to what's going on around them. And that's the approach that we've applied to working with migrant and refugee women affected by the Maribyrnong flood. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the vision of GenWest. So next slide. So GenWest is an organization working towards gender equity. And as you may be familiar, this equity is different from gender equality. So equality focuses on treating everyone exactly the same, but because of past inequalities, that might not be fair. For example, if a workplace like an emergency service has historically been dominated by men, then simply allowing women to work in this field might not create a level playing field. So equity actually involves providing women additional resources or support to help them succeed, or it includes building awareness to both men and women on more inclusive workspaces and increasing everyone's gender equity awareness to make sure that women can succeed. So GenWest is a women's health service. We operate across 7 different LGAs in the western region of Melbourne. And since 1994, we've hosted the region's largest family violence crisis support and prevention program. And in fact, we're the only women's health service that works across the spectrum of primary prevention, early intervention, as well as direct family violence response. So how do we do this? I will show you on the next slide. That we're an integrated family violence service, and we provide specialist family violence crisis support to women, non-binary people, and children. And we deliver health and well-being programs, and we support communities to lead safe and healthy lives by running social and health education programs. And we work with other organizations and councils to advocate for the equal rights and prevention of family violence. And we also support organizations through gender equity and capacity building. Now, you may be wondering, why is GenWest, a family violence organization, talking to an emergency services network? I will explain. So the next slide shows you a picture of the Maribyrnong River. And this was the day of the flood on the 14th of October 2022. And it's a really dense urban area. It's only a few kilometers away from Melbourne CBD. And this was right in our catchment area, very close to our head office. And over 500 homes flooded. And the lives of these 500 families have been really drastically impacted. And in fact, 20 months later, only about half of these families have been able to return home. So one of the 5 priority areas given to us by the Victorian government is actually to support women in a changing society. And we actually have a particular focus on climate change, emergency, and disaster situations. So since the flood, GenWest has been working with the community to support its recovery. And we've particularly focused on women from migrant and refugee backgrounds, which is reflective of the demographics of this area. So we'll go to the next slide, because now that I know a little bit, now you know a little bit about me and the work that we do at GenWest, I would like to find out a little bit more about you. A little bit tricky in this context of a webinar and not seeing everyone's faces, but I'm going to give it a try. To use some polls today so that we can make the session a little bit more interactive. And so we've just launched into the very first question, which asks you a bit more about your role and why you're here today. But also we ask you about your cultural identity. Now, the reason that we ask you about your cultural identity is because we'd like to reflect on who we are as professionals. And what kind of lived experience we bring with us today. So I'll give everyone a chance to complete the poll and see how we're going. And so I hope everyone's been able to see the poll and has had a chance to complete it. And once everyone's completed it, we will see if we can bring up all of the poll results so that we can reflect as a group on the results. There we are. Amazing. Thanks, Jen. That's so good. So you can see actually that the majority of the people in the room today are paid staff members, which is not unsurprising. But there's also quite a few of us who volunteer or do unpaid work in this community, which is very common in the emergency services space. I can also see that the majority of us are Australian. Some of us are New Zealanders, which is exciting. And we already have a representation from the Pacific Islands as well. I do want to note that we have no representation of Indigenous peoples in the room today. And so I just want to make sure that we're aware of that and that we make sure that we are mindful of making sure that their voices are heard as well in this space. Brilliant. Thanks so much for doing that. And I'm excited that it worked. So we'll go to the next slide. And before we go into the specific experience that women had in Maribyrnong, I'd like to first pause and reflect on the experience of women globally. As we all know very well, particularly in this group, our Earth is heating up. We're having climate emergency, and it's causing an increase in natural disasters. And of course, this is disrupting our way of living, our food systems, and everyone's impacted, right? Men, women, children, animals, plants. It's our entire ecosystem. But actually, as some of you might know as well, evidence shows that around 21.5 million people worldwide are displaced every year by climate change related events. But of these, 80% are women, really showing that discrepancy between men and women's experiences. And women face a heightened risk of poverty as a result of their displacement, higher risk of food insecurity, and of violence as they migrate to a safer location. And according to a study conducted by Plan International, women and children are 14 times more likely to die or experience violence in a disaster due to rigid stereotypes. And finally, marginalized groups like migrants, refugees, and other displaced populations are most affected. So how people experience an emergency and a disaster is not the same. Climate change increases existing inequality. And this is why the UN states that climate change's greatest victims are women and girls. And it's also why I've highlighted this quote. If you're invisible in everyday life, your needs will not be thought of, let alone addressed in a crisis situation. All right, now that went really well, I'm going to try one more poll. So we'll go to the next slide. And I'm just going to check what knowledge we have in the room today. I'm very mindful that most people here that I'm talking into the converted, you may already have a really broad knowledge and understanding of gender and intersectionality. So I'd like to gauge your knowledge and understanding with two more polls. So the first one is, how confident are you in your knowledge of how climate change emergencies and disasters impact existing gender inequities? And the second question is, how confident are you in your knowledge of barriers that migrant and refugee women face when accessing emergency management services? So I'll give everyone a few seconds to complete the poll. And then we'll see if we can get the poll results up once we've had most of the responses in. Amazing, thanks. So we can see in the first question how confident we are in this room. So the majority of us is fairly confident in our knowledge of how disasters impact existing gender inequities. So I hope that today I can add a little bit more to that knowledge bank of everyone in the room. And the second question shows that the majority of the people are not confident in understanding the barriers that migrant and refugee women face when accessing emergency services. So I really hope that I can shed some light on that today. Fabulous. Well, then we'll dive into the project that we've done at GenWest. So The project that we ran at Gen West is called Our Community, Our Voice, and we've ran that for the last 18 months. And our aim on working with migrant and refugee women in Maribyrnong was to support their mental health and their well-being during their post-disaster recovery. And the way we did that was through peer-based and bicultural staff, and we also used in-language and culturally safe information. Now, when we say culturally safe information, this means that we really start with building trust and that we really listen to community. And we're always led by what community share that they need and never what others think they may need. And so that's what we did. We started with 6 months of community consultation and engagement, and we simply listened and had conversations. And only after that we truly listened did we deliver information sessions and health and well-being activities. We've also captured their voices and compiled that in a beautiful report called Our Community, Our Voice, and you can find it on the Gen West website. We've also developed a culturally diverse mental health campaign, and we developed equitable disaster management training for frontline emergency services staff. So I'll talk you through the different things that we've done and give you a bit of a taster of it. So on the next slide, what you can see is lots of examples of the work that we've done. But initially, actually, we were only funded for 6 months, and we were funded only to support the mental health and well-being of those affected by the Maribyrnong River flood. But in those 6 months, we realized that this community was not ready to consider their mental health and well-being. They were really busy with insurance and rebuilding and in survival mode and trying to move back into their home. And even though they told us that they experienced trauma, they kind of said mental health is a bit of a luxury. We don't really have time to consider that at the moment. So what we saw was that community needed really small, frequent events, providing a casual and a relaxed space for people to just come together without any agenda. And we realized that only in the longer term that there would be a need and an interest in actual mental health and well-being support. So instead of providing what we're funded to do by the Victorian government, we started with providing really practical support. We heard that there was a massive information gap between what organizations could offer and so what the community knew that they could receive. And so the first thing we did was develop an information booklet in language. So it's that flood recovery information booklet, completely translated to Vietnamese. And all we did was just pull together all the supports available and translated it. And we started to talk to community in language with a bilingual staff member, handing out information through door knocking, letterbox dropping, and meeting community where they were at. So in the end, we actually received funding for 18 months. And in that time, we've delivered many health and well-being sessions, ranging from Easter egg hunts to arts and crafts activities. We've done a bit of pampering and massages. We've done a virtual reality memory activity for teenagers, which is enabling them to recreate personal items that they lost in the flood. And we've also just delivered a mental health and well-being program, which was in people's personal backyards. So we've used gardening working bees as a vehicle to bring people together and provide practical support by rebuilding people's backyards, but also really providing that space for social connection, for grounding, and for information to services. And so it was a really beautiful, practical way to make our community more sustainable. So in our work, I'll show you on the next slide that we engage with a number of best practice principles, and they include responding in a culturally appropriate and gender responsive way. And what that means is that we always consider what are the culturally appropriate activities, the times, and the ways of engagement so that everyone can and wants to attend. And whether this means that you need to host an event on the weekend or on a weeknight, or whether this means that you need to make sure that you have activities for the children so that the parents, and particularly the mums, have their minds free so that they can actually engage in an information session or in any of the activities that we want to host for mums. We also work with a culturally competent and a bilingual workforce. And so they are our trusted community experts. who've been really able to make really deep connections and friendships within the community. We partner with community leaders and cultural groups who are already in the community. For example, we worked with a Vietnamese leader in the community who already had 700 Vietnamese gardeners in his network when we were hosting the gardening bees. But we've also connected with the Ethiopian church and invited them to join our mental health campaign. And so they became one of the faces for the campaign. The other thing that we've done is that we embed strength-based service models, and we look at what the community does well, whether it be gardening or wanting to connect with others. And we're currently supporting a community member who loves cooking and loves sharing her recipes and her food. And so we're trying to just simply base the work that we do on what the community wants and what they're good at. And so as a result of this work, we've built really strong relationships with over 120 families, 20 organizations, and at least 8 community leaders. So we'll go to the next slide. As I mentioned before, and I believe it's the reason that we've been invited to this network today, is that we've collected all the stories that we've heard from migrant and refugee women in a beautiful report about the lessons from the 2022 Maribyrnong flood. So if you haven't already read it, you can download an online copy on our website. And to develop this advocacy report, we did a literature review on migrant and refugee women's experiences of flood response and recovery. And we've also reviewed the Gender Emergency Management Guidelines and worked with Gender and Disaster Australia. We've conducted 10 in-depth interviews with community members. Sometimes these interviews went for hours, and they were conducted in language, in English, Hindi, or Vietnamese, in the comfort of people's homes. And what's the most important thing to be mindful of is that these interviews were held after 6 months of community engagement. And so we've already built trust, connections. And so these interviews were really rich and insightful conversations. On the next slide, you'll see the 6 key themes that came out of the report. So the first one was around early warning systems, or the lack of those early warning systems. We've looked at the financial strain and the housing displacement and their particular impact on women and families. We've looked at health and well-being and how to manage existing illnesses, but also the impact of the flood itself on health and well-being. We've looked at safety and the lack thereof during the flood event and in the aftermath, when only a few families returned to the region. And it was stunning to hear about how many people were robbed. One family, in fact, was robbed 5 times after the flood. We've also looked at support systems, both informal support and the support of many spontaneous volunteers, but also at how communities might be reluctant to ask for help and ask for support. And finally, we looked at community resilience and their preparation for the future and how we can support their resilience and knowledge of disaster preparedness. So those six key themes, they led us to providing 9 key recommendations for change. So what I'll do now is I'll go through each of these 9 recommendations, and I'll do that by using stories from the migrant and refugee women themselves as an example of how we got to these recommendations. So yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So the first recommendation we had is really about communication. So on the day of the flood, there was a severe lack of early warning systems, but also really a lack of communication in terms of flood preparedness, and particularly for those with low levels of English. This was actually a known floodplain, but those living there didn't know that. They were underprepared, they were taken by surprise, and they didn't take any action to protect themselves or their families. They had not secured possessions, they had not moved away cars, and they had not evacuated on time themselves. So this quote says, I took it very light and easy because we've never been through a flood before. So I had no fear, no worries, nothing like that. and we saw water approaching our house, and we thought that it was okay. We had no understanding of what flood water could do to our property, our furniture, and all the stuff in our house. And this is really why we recommend that we develop community-based early warning models to improve disaster awareness and early warning awareness to make sure that residents action these warnings. And we also want to develop more effective strategies to communicate the specific disaster risks that are relevant to a community in events. The next recommendation and slide is about financial security. In this community, there was no preparation for their financial security, and many migrant and refugee families were either not insured or they were not sufficiently insured. So as this one mom said, initially she actually mentioned that she felt really comfortable because she knew she had insurance. And then she said, when we found out we don't have flood cover, that's when I actually broke down. Everything is gone. We don't have insurance cover for the flood. She didn't realize that her home insurance policy didn't include a flood event. Another one said, we don't want to admit that we come down to financial hardship, but we are. And as we know, no one likes asking for help or a handout. And another mom said, in Vietnam, this kind of insurance doesn't exist. So I wish I knew about contents insurance cover. And this really kind of shows that lack of local knowledge and the lack of the Australian knowledge about the Australian insurance system and how to navigate it. And so this is why we recommend that we have a national insurance system reform, easier said than done, to ensure that insurance systems are simple, easy to use, and effective at compensating people for losses caused by disasters. And we really need to deliver place-based, disaster-specific financial literacy programs as part of our disaster preparedness strategy, with really a focus on understanding and navigating the insurance system that we have in Australia. Brilliant. Now we'll go to the next slide on housing. So this recommendation talks about housing, and in many disasters, as well as considering our current housing crisis, this community too had challenges in accessing emergency and short-term accommodation, as well as long-term instability. And as mentioned before, many still haven't returned to their homes more than 20 months after the flood. So when looking at accommodation, we also need to make sure that they're tailored to the specific needs of diverse population groups, including women, children, and people with disabilities or people who experience a chronic illness, and as well as people with a refugee and a migrant background. And as this quote says, my parents were offered emergency accommodation somewhere near the airport, but they didn't want to go because of their comfort zone and because of the language barrier. And they can't communicate in English. And I was communicating on their behalf. And they get very nervous driving around places that they're not familiar with. And so this is why we, in the report, talk about a recommendation of a review of emergency accommodation housing plans in metropolitan settings, as well as ensuring that they meet the needs of diverse population groups. The next recommendation is about safety. And as I mentioned, this Migrant community has had their homes broken into so many times, and they had their last valuables that they had left from the flood stolen in the aftermath. And these incidents really caused significant ongoing psychological distress and fear on top of the trauma from the flood. And actually, all of the women that we interviewed in this report spoke about feeling unsafe, and which is really quite typical of a disaster in this urban setting. There was many people around them in the area, around the area of the disaster, but no one actually living in the region that was flooded. The lights were broken, there's no social security, and so there was a tremendous amount of robberies. And so as this quote says, I'm scared that the robbers might come back. The chance that they're coming back is very high, and I know that it's still happening all around us, and it's very scary. I get up more often at night, and when hearing a noise outside or inside the house, it scares me. And I told my husband, I can't carry on like this anymore, even though my husband has installed the camera, the roller shutters, the fence, and even more lighting to make me feel safer. And I try to be strong, but I can't handle it. I still can't sleep at night. And this is why we recommend that we need comprehensive community safety plans for during and after a natural disaster, and particularly in urban areas. So the next recommendation is about family violence. And I'm sure that most of you here know that it's well documented that during times of disaster, women experience a higher rate of family violence. Women who live with a violent partner before a disaster are likely to experience isolation. They might have restricted access to a car or money, or they may have difficulties in evacuating. But there was also a study done with 30 women across Victoria after the 2019 bushfires. And they found that incidences of family violence also increased after a disaster. And so I wanted to share a quote with you from Colleen, who was one of the volunteers on ground in this community. And she told us that we register people for a couple of purposes. And one reason is so that if someone's looking for them, that they know that's where they are. But if they don't want to be looked for, we ask that as well, because, I was a volunteer during the Black Summer, and there were quite a few women who just had that look. And I said, he's after you, isn't he? And so we're also trained to make sure that people who don't want to be found, because women are the most vulnerable after a natural disaster, because if they've hidden themselves, a man might come to the relief centre to find them, because the relief centres are a really public place. And this is why we recommend that all disaster preparation, response, and recovery plans include specialist family violence agencies. And in this particular community, we actually haven't had any known incidences of family violence. And whether or not this was due to our interventions in this area, we'll never know. But we need to make sure that they're involved, because we know that this incidence of family violence increases during a disaster. Great. We'll go to the next recommendation, which is all about children. A lot of mothers spoke to us about the mental and physical challenges the flood had on their kids, and particularly in relation to feeling unsafe and unsettled. And we also heard a lot about mothers' guilt and their feelings of shame that they couldn't perform their roles in their families and communities as they'd done before the flood. And we also heard about the important role schools play in supporting children in this unsettled time. So one school we heard that they brought in specialists to talk about the children's feelings after the flood to help them make sense of it. But others weren't as supportive. This mom, for example, told us that we were already moving around and she had so much on. And then after the flood, she was very unsettled at school. She was just starting year 7, so she just changed schools. And they took her to view natural disasters in the cinema. And they wanted to do an excursion past our house. She was very worried about that. And so she started doing repetitive, quite OCD types of things. And she definitely had a big stress response. They didn't come on the excursion to our house because I wrote a very strong letter suggesting do not come. But the damage was already done. School was not a safe place for her. She was actually reliving the trauma. And so this is why we recommend that all disaster preparation, response, and recovery plans really include a specific focus on children, and that it must include working with educational institutions to provide support to children during and post disaster. So we'll go to the next slide, which is all about community and the importance of community connections and resilience. In this Maribyrnong community, a very urban community, many were not well connected with their local community and their neighborhood prior to the flood. Many did not know their neighbors, and that's typical for that really urban context. However, we had a lot of spontaneous volunteers support this community after the flood. For example, we had a flood warrior group on Facebook, and they had over 3,000 members offering their support. But as you can imagine, their support was not always well coordinated. So as this mum said, the most difficult thing for me was that we had to wait endlessly for help and support, and I had no choice. And for 4 weeks, people were giving me shampoos and toiletries, but no one actually asked us what we want. It was more like, this is available, so take it. And so this is really why we recommend promoting community cohesion and resilience, both in preparation for a future disaster and to bring disaster-affected residents together in the aftermath of a disaster to really enable that peer support. And we also need local spontaneous volunteer plans to mobilize and coordinate spontaneous volunteer networks during disasters. We'll go to the next recommendation, which is all about climate adaptation. We know our Earth is heating up. We know that we'll have an increase in natural disasters, and we need to support our communities to adapt to climate change. Now, in this particular community, we've continued to build on a floodplain, and now Melbourne Water this year has done remodeling in this area, and they've actually increased the flood zones, which has tremendous financial and insurance implications for the new flood zones. But it also gives us an opportunity to work with community to support the climate adaptation and support their preparedness. Because as this quote shows again, is that this community really lacked that prior warning and that prior education about living on a floodplain. So this mom said that I'd seen a warning on the Emergency Victoria page stating that at about 11 a.m. or 12 p.m. on the following day, water levels in the river would rise to about 2.1 meters. So that night we went to the river to check, and if the water rose that high, we assumed it wouldn't affect our house. And so we went to bed unconcerned. And later I felt so disappointed in myself that I didn't know how to prepare for the flood to avoid damage. And so this is why we recommend we really need more strategies for climate adaptation in urban contexts and collaborate with local communities and those most vulnerable to the negative consequences of extreme weather events. And then we'll move to the last recommendation. And this one is all about implementing the Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines. As I mentioned at the start, we've reviewed the GEM guidelines as part of our literature research for our report. And these guidelines really emphasize the influence of gender roles in disaster preparation and response. And research also shows that rigid gender roles are amplified in disaster and can really deepen that gender inequality. And gender norms mean that women often take more responsibility for the safety and the health of others, particularly children or older people or people with disabilities, whilst men try to protect the home and the property. And the GEM guidelines warn emergency services that these exacerbated gender roles and stereotypes, they really limit both men and women in ways that can reduce their capacity for community resilience and recovery. And it actually increases the risks for women and children, including increasing the risk of family violence. So we actually saw these rigid gender roles quite a bit in this Maribyrnong community. For example, we heard from one mum in this quote, and she said, I reached out to the Flood Warriors group, which was that volunteer group on Facebook, and I asked them for some dinner. And the Flood Warriors group came with dinner that night, but my husband was at the front of the house cleaning, and he told them, we don't need food. My wife can cook. You should give it to those who need it more than us. We still have the kitchen. And so at around 6:30 p.m., whilst we were busy cleaning, my kids were hungry. And I asked my husband to leave the lights on so that the people from the Flood Warrior group knew that we lived at the back. And my husband asked if I was waiting for the food. And he told me that he'd refuse the food because I could cook. And looking back at that day, it was such a hard time for all of us. And it really shows the husband was doing it, came from the right place, but it was putting so much extra burden on the mum who was trying to feed her children. And so this is why we recommend we need to focus on implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the GEM guidelines to really build that community awareness and understanding of effective strategies with a gender lens in emergency services. That's a lot from me. So that's all about the recommendations. And I also wanted to share this image with you. This was taken at one of our community events. In this community, we know that connected communities are healthy and resilient communities in times of disaster as they work together to adapt to climate change in their local context. And so this is what Gen West has done. We've promoted connection, we've promoted health and well-being in the flood-affected community by bringing together displaced community members, giving people an opportunity to share their stories and their resilience, and supporting people to access the services that support their recovery. And in response to the findings of our report, we also wanted to increase the mental health literacy and awareness. So on the next slide, you can see a little bit more about our mental health campaign. In this campaign, we focused on the message that it's okay to ask for help, but also to encourage men to support the women in their lives so they don't need to ask for help. And the reason that we developed these key messages is because most of the moms and women we spoke to spoke about their guilt and their failure when they felt that they could not put the priorities of their children first. And we found that during times of disaster, there's that real need for information to counteract rigid and restrictive gender stereotypes. So this is one of the videos that we made. We made about 18 promotional videos. Let's see if we can play it and you can hear it, hopefully.
मैंने देखा है कि कम्युनिटी में हमारे दोस्तों में ले लीजिए, काफ़ी दोस्त ऐसे हैं जो घर का काम नहीं करते हैं। जब वो जॉब करते हैं, जॉब में बहुत मेहनती हैं वो, लेकिन घर आके नहीं, उनको ये मन में लगता है कि शायद ये जो हिस्सा है घर के कामों का, ये बीवी के हिस्से ही आता है, ये मेरे हिस्से नहीं आता। तो मैं कोशिश करता हूँ जब कभी मौका लगता है कि मैं उनको ऐसा दिखाऊँ, क्योंकि बोल नहीं सकते आप सबके लिए। तो जब भी कोई मेरे घर में आता है तो मैं उनके सामने आई मेक ए पॉइंट। एक बार ऐसा मेरा एक दोस्त घर पे आ रहा था, तो उसने जब दरवाज़ा खोला तो मैंने बर्तन धोने शुरू कर दिए। धुले हुए बर्तन ही मैंने सिंक में रखे, धोने शुरू कर दिए ताकि वो देखे और थोड़ा मैसेज मिल जाए उनको।
That's just a really short snippet. I'll turn it off now. A really short snippet of Kuldeep. We have a longer video of him on our website, as well as some of our other champions in the campaign. And we're also trying to promote them as much as we can on social media, so hopefully you can check them out. Finally, in response to the report, we've also developed a training module for emergency services staff. And we've run the first few sessions of this training in May and June of this year. It's been really well received, and many said that the training was really eye-opening and insightful. So in this module, we reflect on our personal experiences in times of disaster. We understand and build our understanding of systemic barriers from a gender and a culturally diverse perspective. We focus on building understanding from a trauma-informed response, and we reflect on response gaps with a culturally safe and a gendered lens. And finally, we really want to empower communities and increase their access to support. So I hope that this presentation has been an opportunity for yourself to increase your understanding of the systemic barriers that migrant and refugee women face in times of disaster. And if you're interested in learning more about inclusive practices and you would like to attend this training, then please contact me. So that's it. I hope you found that insightful, and hopefully we get some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wenny. What a fabulous presentation, and what amazing work you've been doing with your local community. A couple of things really stand out for me, and one, first off, is the role of Gen West and the role of community organisations like yours, the role that they play within their communities in supporting communities before, during and after emergencies, disasters, extreme weather events, what have you. I think there's a really growing recognition of the role of organisations like yourselves, and the fact that you can, produce reports like this and undertake research and make, really important recommendations to make positive changes to policy and practice within emergency management is really important. And yes, Lisa, we will make sure we share the QR code before the end of today. The other thing I think that is really important too is that, a lot of what we know and learn from emergencies and disasters tends to be based in rural or regional areas, we don't have a lot of experience and don't necessarily have the opportunity to learn so much what happens in urban areas during disasters. And, you know, this is a really unique situation and a really unique opportunity. And, you know, and hugely grateful to you and, of course, all of those people that participated in your research and in your work that have contributed to the findings in this report. It's really, really important, and it's only going to become more important as our cities, you know, suffer under things like, you know, heat wave and flooding and potentially other disastrous events. And finally, the thing that also stood out for me was the intersectional lens that you've taken here, you know, really combining that sort of gender and multicultural community perspective. I think, you know, there's been amazing work done around gender, but it does tend to view gender through a white Western lens, if you like. And I think it's really, really important and really exciting to see this intersectional approach coming through in the work that you've done. So congratulations to you and the whole team at Gen West, and I certainly hope the message gets spread far and wide, and I know that me and all of our members and those present here will do the same. I'd like to open it up for some questions now, and I can see that we've got links in the chat there to the report, and of course you'll be able to access the QR code there as well. Rather than question through the chat, we might just do a hands up for anybody that would like to ask any questions of Wenny. Don't be shy. Thank you, Sandra. Go ahead.
Mute. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very, very much, Wenny. I have experience working overseas in disaster work, and so a lot of what you've said is really resonates with me as well. And the first thing that comes, or the last thing, so the very last point that you made, which is absolutely critical. We all know what DRR means, right? Disaster is... Why aren't we doing it in the broader sense? And I'm not talking about the women that are here today. I'm talking about that having us really advocating for that to be embedded in our local council disaster management plans. It really should be, and that then cuts across some of the things that you talked about today that came from the people that were majorly affected and are continually affected. Had they have had that opportunity and a strong advocacy around those DRR opportunities and the mitigation that needs to go with that would perhaps have made a small difference to the parts that you've actually highlighted that those women and men faced. Yeah, so that's just one thing that I'm really trying to wave my banner about with one small voice here. And the other thing I would say is I live in a regional area, and an area where we don't see our let me put it this way, our migrant community in many ways is quite invisible. They're there and so on and so forth. But then, you know, like I'd love to see you come up and be up here and set up here and get some stuff happening. And I'm sure I'm not alone with that. You know, it's really important that we actually do this work that you've actually identified and presented so beautifully today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandra. And just in response, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, and particularly in regional areas, it could be migrants who've only been there for, you know, a relatively shorter amount of time.
Absolutely.
Because they're, you know, they need to live in those regions for visa purposes and all sorts.
Yes.
And so they really get information from a completely different place than white Australians get information from. And so, you know,
not always accurate.
Sorry?
Yeah. And that information is not always the information they need, or it's not accurate. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I think one of the other complexities for migrant and refugee populations is they're so busy establishing themselves for the first couple of years, you know, getting their kids settled into school, finding somewhere to live, finding a job, you know, finding their way around where they live. And that was highlighted in the presentation just there with the temporary accommodation, you know, many miles away from where those communities were. That really preparing for something that might or might not happen is pretty low on the agenda and on the priority list.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's right.
Natisha's asked a question: is the training module available for people to complete outside of Gen West?
No, we've just developed it, the training module, and so far we've only delivered it face to face. But if there is interest to do it in an online setting, that's definitely something that we could explore.
Absolutely. I suggest you email Wendy later and we'll make sure we share her contact details with you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from people who are here? Put your hand up. Sally.
Thank you, and thank you, and a great presentation. And you know, you raised some really important points for us all, because our demographics of all our communities are changing, and they're changing really quickly. You know, we're seeing in New Zealand many more immigrants from, you know, India, Asia. So how we engage with people is going to change. And like you say, people go to where they trust, you know, their communication vests in that. But what I was interested in, because a lot of the issues you raise, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you look at it, have been raised many times, you know, like, you know, those of us that are my age, we sort of wonder if we're ever going to actually get it in an improved state. Was there other agencies that reached out to you, or, you know, and I'm not trying to do any name, shame or blame, but I'm just looking at who was around that might have reached out and said, oh, by the way, we can support and help you with this because we've seen it before, you know, like, did any of the other agencies who are involved in emergency management reach out and offer you any other resources or their support to partner with you in this work?
So what we found is, so we were part of the Social Recovery Committee organised by the local council. And what we found is what I mentioned, so that we had all these emergency management services who knew what they were doing in the recovery space. And Gen West had never really worked in that disaster space before. So they were delivering all the services, but they weren't able to actually connect to the community to get them the services. So what we are basically, our role was just to be a conduit between the services and the community. And we were often actually reached out to by services to go, this is what we're offering. Can you please tell them that this is what we're doing? And so that was our role. We were like the bridge, to the point that we're now actually also part of the Community Recovery Committee as like a community voice, because we have so many different, you know, contexts and people that we want to speak to. And there's also that real distrust. So the other thing that we did is a lot of people in the community felt so incredibly let down by government that they were in this situation that shouldn't have happened. It could have been mitigated. They could have had warnings, you know. They felt so distrustful that they didn't want to come. So there's actually quite a few events that we organized, and they said, as long as council's not coming, because if council's there, we won't come, you know. So it was kind of like, so our work has been about rebuilding trust between both.
And I think you make a really great point there, Wenny, around the role of your organisation being a conduit. You know, as a community-based organisation, you know, you engender a lot of trust with your clients and with the community more broadly, and it's a trust that's developed over a very long period of time and through a whole lot of different approaches from outreach to cultural inclusion and safety and so forth. Particularly, I think, for migrant and refugee communities, there can be a sort of an inherent mistrust of anyone in a uniform, of government, because they've come from countries where those organisations and entities are not trustworthy. And so for you to be acting as that conduit is a really important role that you play. And I think that those roles need to be much more recognised and supported within the overall emergency management kind of arrangements.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that you mentioned the uniform. We had a lot of feedback. There was one session held, I think it was just 2 months after the flood, and there was it was a very formal meeting with men in uniform, and he actually was wearing a gun on that information session too, where they're talking about the flood and they're trying to support the community, and that was so ill received that actually further created that distrust, because it wasn't done in a way that people felt safe to be there.
Absolutely. What a horrendous example, Winnie. Yeah, that's really awful.
But it was done with the best intentions, but you know
Of
what I mean? Like,
course,
it just
of
wasn't well
course.
received. That's
Of
all.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Any further reflections or comments from anybody? Has anybody had similar experiences or seen something within their organisations or their communities that resonates with what you've heard today? No, everyone's gone quiet.
Yeah. Could I just make one further point,
Please,
please?
Sandra.
Yeah, and just in my background really is in child protection and protection systems, and I've worked in the UN system in disaster response and management in the Pacific and in Timor for a long time, and protection really covers the matter of child protection as well as gender-based violence, about criminality, and that full range of safety issues, and it actually works. It works, and we've seen it work and how it works in community. And there's some benefit in actually having the thinking processes around encompassing that area as protection, and that includes then people in uniforms who are actually hopefully not wearing their gun, and also being able to be really having some constructive input into those processes. The one thing that I picked up that you said that really, and it sounded to me like the child protection matters that were done for the kids for school, and the little girl that ended up having to, end up very stressed. I mean, let's do a drive-through or a drive-past. I mean, we really need agencies fit for purpose. If you're going to do child protection, make sure you know what child rights are about. Sorry, but I'm saying it. And make sure you know what psychosocial support is like for children, and what other activities they need, and what they don't need, basically. And there's lots and lots of excellent, programs and initiatives that are in a global sense that have actually been put forward, because we all need to know those things, I think. Yeah. That's enough out of me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you. I know there is a lot of work going on within a lot of individual agencies to try and improve their inclusion and accessibility, as well as their own diversity, so that they better reflect the communities they work with. But it's a little bit of a piecemeal approach rather than a sort of a collective best practice approach, which I think would probably serve communities better. Winnie, did you have any final comments you'd like to share with everyone while we've still got people here?
No, just to say thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. And a great work that you guys do in bringing so many people together, women in emergencies. It's an amazing network. I'm very impressed.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Well, look, thank you, Winnie, so much for making the time to share your work with us today. Please let your community members know that we all attended, that we were really interested in their work and really value, their lived experience as well. Thank you to all our all members who've attended today. Please remember to complete the member survey. It's really important, as it will help us deliver the things that you want and you need. We're a fabulous network. If you're not a member, make sure you join. Hope to see you at the next webinar, and look out for our next newsletter coming up next week. Thank you. Goodbye.